Hi there, welcome to the Carr Brothers. It's episode 110. I'm Jack.
And I'm Jeff.
And I'm Jody, the third of the three Carr Brothers. Welcome tonight to a fantastic show for Carr Brothers Live on CHCO and Facebook Live.
Yeah, and we're also on YouTube as well.
Okay.
So we want to welcome our viewers. We have two guests on. We're going to talk primarily about carbon tax and maybe some other things as well. Introduce our guests. We have an economist and the chair of political science at UNB, Herb Emery. Thank you very much for being with us here, Herb.
Thanks for having me on.
And we have a longtime former MP of the Parliament, Dan McTeague, and now the president of Canadians for Affordable Energy. Thank you, Mr. McTeague, for being here. Well, let's get it started right off. Carbon tax has been in the news quite a bit over the last couple of years, but primarily over the last few weeks. A lot of the premiers are calling for the Prime Minister to scrap the carbon tax, and a lot of chatter and talk throughout the country in the media, social media. So what we wanted to do is give our viewers a chance to be able to hear from some of the experts of what is a carbon tax, what is this carbon tax, and to help unpack it for us. So. Mr. Emery, we'll start with you, and I guess just to tell us a little bit about the carbon tax.
Yeah, I'll be a little careful because now that I'm known as a so-called expert, I'll just try and explain how.
Don't worry about that.
Yeah.
So with the carbon tax, you're interested in how it's levied, what it does, what its purpose is. So if you think about, it's called a carbon tax now, but that's actually a reframing from when it was originally brought in, which was a carbon price. And so the logic is that if you allow people to emit greenhouse gases without consequence, they're going to produce too many of them. So the logic that economists had was if you put a price on the emissions, people have to take account of that when they decide how much to drive, how much to produce iron and steel, and they will go to what we would call a socially efficient level if you price the carbon at the appropriate environmental damage. Mm-hmm. Now, at some point along the way, somebody decided we can also use this to lower emissions. So if we just keep pushing that price up to encourage you to substitute away from dirty things to clean things, then we'll see emissions drop. And Mark Jacquard at Simon Fraser estimated the carbon price would need to go to around $300 a ton in order to get there, which is pretty high.
Yeah.
So the substitution effect that comes in is basically make the dirty stuff expensive to encourage you to use less of it. That's one form of substitution. Or switch into a cleaner technology like an electric vehicle instead of a regular car. Now the problem with those price mechanisms, they make you poorer because a lot of things you can't substitute away in the short run. You've raised the price of everything in level. And so what they were doing with the revenue neutral scheme, like Sean Graham wanted to bring in 2008 in New Brunswick, was give the money back to the households or consumers. And the idea there is you compensate them to the point that they're worse off because of the higher price, but you've used their revenue to compensate them so they have as much income with purchasing power as they had before. Now the federal government went one step further. Because they don't rebate back to business and because high income earners don't get the rebate, they were overcompensating households at the lower end of the income distribution, so it turned into a bit of a income redistribution scheme along with a climate scheme. And so as a consequence of that, nobody was going to be made more poor off. But when the carbon tax debate came in, everybody uncoupled the perception of the rebate, which is overcompensating, giving most Canadians too much, against the carbon tax. And so we want to axe the tax, but if they do it, it's actually going to be a tax increase on most households because they're going to lose the rebate, which is going to be a bigger cost to them than saving is what they're going to get on the carbon tax. So it gets a little complicated. The reason it gets like that is we don't measure emissions. We don't tax emissions, we tax the fuels that create them. And so it's a proxy type measure to get at it, which is again why the public isn't sure what to make of it. But the amount of GHG emissions that we're dealing with, that's an estimate. We don't actually have a magic measure that goes out and says this is how many tons we have this year. And so there's a whole bunch of other aspects you can get into, but the logic of it was give people an incentive to change, be agnostic as a government as to what the change would be. You just let the market decide what they're going to be able to do and compensate households so they're no worse off.
So if you're no worse off, how does that change your behavior?
Because again, if I change the relative price of doing something, I'm still going to discourage you from doing the thing I don't want you to do,
And then
but I'm not penalizing you for having to make the choice.
So psychologically, every few days when you fill up your gas tank, the prices are high and you feel psychologically that I should be cutting back and finding other measures. But then you're still getting the compensation every quarter or whatever, or the rebate.
Suppose that I wanted you to drink more wine and less
Right.
beer. I could raise the price of beer, use the revenue to recycle back, but I'm encouraging you to substitute into wine, which may not be your preferred to drink that much wine. You still have as much purchasing power of your income as you had before, but I've created an incentive for you to stop drinking beer and to start drinking wine, which we've decided socially is where we want you to go. So we're using prices to create the incentives to change your choices, change your behavior. But in order to make sure that we're not leaving you worse off, we're going to compensate you with some kind of transfer. Now, there's debate amongst economists with that because there's one view that what's the point in creating the incentive if you just take away the sting? And so in order to get meaningful climate action, we should not have been rebating back to households. We should have made it hurt so that they don't live in rural, so that they don't drive cars. And so we would be reorganizing our society in a sense because everyone would have to move where there's urban transit.
Yeah.
And that leads me to a point where when you say if we remove the tax, we also remove the rebate, and everybody feels that or loses. But I would argue that myself, who drives 45 minutes to Fredericton every day, that pays more tax than David Kuhn that lives downtown, he's going to lose. But I'm probably going to come ahead because now I'm paying zero tax and I'm not getting the rebate.
But you will come ahead.
Right.
Because again, the rebate is based on the average
Yep.
consumption, not
Right.
your actual.
Actually.
Yep.
And so it's a tricky thing to
It
think
is.
about. But
Well,
And it's hard to
again,
blanket everybody with the same formula, basically.
But remember, the federal government wanted to double the rebate for rural to
They
address
did,
that.
yes.
And then they did the heating oil carve out in part to address
That's
that
right.
problem that they were losing the rural
Right.
votes over.
Yes. They realized that it was making hardship for rural New Brunswickers.
And when will we know whether it changes the behavior overall? Like, is this about climate change, or is it you spend so much time into this scheme?
But there's a new report out federally that shows that carbon pricing has changed behavior and reduced emissions, but it hasn't been as important as the output-based pricing price mechanism on large industry.
Yeah.
So one
Because
reason
that's immediate. That's a
Yeah.
tax immediate, and they don't see it. They don't see that come back.
No, but the interesting part is that observation has made carbon pricing on consumers expendable because the reality is the left of the spectrum politically wants to go after industry anyway.
Yeah.
And so when we started
Sure.
saying industry can pay more and that will get us cleaner quicker than if we tax households that can't really switch, that was the David Kuhn argument, you'll see that there will be this weird coalition that everybody agrees, let's get rid of carbon pricing, but let's go after industry, which has been the Canadian thing for
which
about
is
8
easy.
years.
But which is what we're already doing with the OBPS, the output-based pricing system.
Well, they can get a little more aggressive with it because that threshold, as you know, if you're best in class, you don't pay a lot of carbon tax.
Right.
And so if they start getting more stringent and the threshold that you have to get below, and if you were an early adopter of clean technology, like a lot of companies in our region are, they're in big trouble because they've already given up at
Right.
baseline the easiest gains,
That's right.
and the next ones are going to be really expensive.
Exactly.
So you mentioned the estimate was $300 a ton. What is this carbon tax scheme at in terms of a per ton?
We're at $80.
We're at 80.
80. So then,
When it was
Does that
introduced, we
not
were
tell
only
us-
supposed to go to 50.
and does that not tell us then, in a way, that we're not going to make a difference in our behavior because we're not really charging? If that's the theory, you're going to charge it as a disincentive.
So this is where the economists are a bit tricky on this one because economists never cared if it reduced emissions as long as you priced it. So so you're driving your truck, if you've paid the carbon price in your fuel, you can live happily ever after knowing that you've paid for the environmental damage, and so it's efficient what you're doing.
Yeah.
So the economists always said you could reduce emissions. They never said you have to.
No, exactly.
And then when the federal government realized the optics of a $300
Yeah.
ton carbon tax, they reverted to the clean fuel standard, coal phase out, and regulations, which are often more effective for reducing emissions, but are more costly to do. But the advantage of them is we usually hide them. Consumers aren't aware that they're paying the costs associated with them. carbon pricing economists like because it was a transparent price like the HST.
But politicians
Right.
will feel the heat because it's at the cash register.
Yeah.
And we're seeing 35 years ago with GST and GST and the whole manufacturer's tax, and we had to explain, and everyone hated it.
It's the same problem.
It's the same exact
If you
problem.
can't explain it, it's tough.
Well, let's
Need to
bring
keep it
Yeah.
simple.
let's bring Dan McTeague
Yeah.
in.
Well, what's he saying about
with
all
the
this?
president of the Canadians for Affordable Energy, and Mr. McTeague, this carbon tax, and when you factor in the rebate, is the average Canadian better off with this tax or worse off?
Well, it depends how you measure that. I'm sorry I couldn't hear everything that was being said there. There's a jet flying over here. We're in the apron of Pearson Airport here, so sometimes it's a little more difficult to pay attention. Apologies if I'm repeating or if I'm contradicting anyone. But it seems that there seems to be a growing consensus in Canada that it is not working. And there may be a number of reasons for that. We could look at it from an economics point of view, which we've done. The science behind this also has to be considered, which is that, all of this is predicated on the belief that we have a climate emergency. Now, not everybody believes that. Not everybody is required to believe that. And there is a pretty significant battle, a furtive battle, if you will, among scientists. Some will call them each other's deniers, whatever the case may be. The impact on consumers, I think, is now being lost. The idea, the intention behind this may be one thing, as expressed over the past 10 years. But I have seen increasingly, as the carbon tax begins to build every year, 4 cents, 8 cents, then 11 cents, 14 cents, 17 cents, plus HST, plus a second carbon tax, a clean fuel standard, plus, and I think I heard reference to the OBPS. When you start to measure these things, the consequences may be far more have far more ramifications, not just for consumers but for business. One of the discussions I'm sure we have to have is to talk about carbon leakage. Here, of course, making a country that may not be very well suited to this kind of pricing, given its uniqueness both as a producer of energy, a huge exporter of that energy. So naturally, they will produce more than a substantial amount, perhaps more than a per capita number of emissions, but also to consider that globally, we are one of the coldest nations on the face of this planet, so our use of energy may be greater. There's another problem that I've encountered over the past few years. In 2019, when the federal government made two changes, one went from the promise of no more than $50 a ton to $170 a ton. And now an open door to the idea that maybe it will need more than that. I hear that Mark Jacquard suggesting, as an economist of note from British Columbia, maybe 300. Bank of Canada considering $1,000 a ton. When you put these things in perspective and you begin to impact the people's ability to make ends meet, no matter what the signal that's involved, it may be too quick for many people to absorb. And I think that's where this is being lost. So we have to look now not just at the cost on energy, which the Bank of Canada and many others look at, but what are the consequential effects? IMF comes out and says for every 1% increase in the price of gasoline, fuel, there is a 0.04% impact on inflation. If I look at much of Atlantic Canada today with that 17.61 cent carbon tax plus 6 to 8 cent second carbon tax, which will eventually be 18 cents as it is in British Columbia, I'm looking at a scenario of 15, 18%. 18% times, my math is not great, that might represent up to 0.7% of inflation. So does the public get this? I would say over the years they haven't said much about it, but they're now starting to complain. I think the complaints aren't just being picked up politically because it's low-hanging fruit. You're taxing people, they don't like the tax, they may not see the rebate, may not get the rebate. Then we have the whole parliamentary budget officer. Now, this is a fellow, Yves Giroux, who does not have a political axe to grind. He's not a member of a party. Full disclosure, I have only been a member of one party, the Liberal Party of Canada, although of late I'm sure that they probably don't think I am. But Yves Giroux made a very important observation. He said, if we looked at carbon taxes and the rebates, only the rebates as they affect fuel and heating, then yes, people are, generally speaking, better off. But as we look at the economic implications, the fiscal implications, it's much greater than that. I mentioned, of course, things like, for instance, business and carbon leakage and whatnot. But Overall, he said that most would not be better off. Now, that doesn't mean that some are doing extraordinarily well, some get nothing at all, and they're doing very well. But if the target was to bring people on board, I think the mission is being is lost and may very well have to be scrubbed because it's not proceeded from the right angle. I'll terminate that with this final comment. I had a chance to read some of the work, and this is not my bailiwick. I don't pretend to be an economist, but William Nordhaus made it fairly clear. He won the Nobel Prize for his work on this study on carbon, that you don't confuse the carbon pricing with other forms of regulation, in a nutshell. And again, I can't express this again as the professor will be able to. What we are doing in Canada, I think, is going at it too fast. We're talking not only one carbon tax, we're talking about a cap on emissions, we're talking about electric vehicle mandates, we're talking about a national building code, we're talking about electricity emissions caps, and we're also talking about a second carbon tax, the clean fuel standard. I know that's a political
aggressive
comment, but that is way further than anyone else could have imagined. It's any wonder that Canada, if I looked at last year's numbers, was it WEF or who put this out? $83.5 billion collected in global carbon taxes equivalent. Canada collected $8.3 billion. So, considering the value of the Canadian dollar, we're doing more than our fair share. If we're 1.5% of global emissions, but we're paying a carbon tax that equals somewhere in the vicinity of about 8-9%, I think it's fair to say Canada is probably going at this a little too quickly, and no wonder people are walking away.
Well, and add on to that, Dan, the price of food's going up, housing, everything is at a premium, and you just pile that all on to consumers. I mean, I was talking to a used car dealer today, and the interest rate on a used car that's not only 4 years old is 9.9%. Like, people just cannot. It's too much at one time, and it's somewhere it's got to give and bust. So I want to go back to the PBO's comments that you were talking about, and how the PBO said that most Canadians really are better off if you only consider, what was it, gas and oil, I think. So a few years ago, did the PBO not acknowledge at that point in time that we were getting less back than what we were putting in? And is that because he broadened it? Can you explain that to us?
The PBO basically took a much greater look at all of it. And regardless of where one stood on this, the Liberals said, oh no, he claims that it's better for the average Joe out there. But they then, I think page 3 of his last document last May, pointed out that in fact, if you looked at it as a whole, its implications as it spreads to the economy, then you have to consider that it's not as good. And of course, I take no pleasure in saying in 2019, your own premiers, all 4 of them, came to the work I had done with Professor Ross McKittrick, LFX and Associates, to point out that the first round of the carbon tax, the second carbon tax, that is to say the clean fuel standard, was completely devoid of something you would always do when you produce something called a RIAS, a regulatory impact analysis statement. They did not do a cost-benefit analysis. Hence, Atlantic Canada and their premiers, regardless of their partisanship at the time, stood up, wrote a letter to the Prime Minister, wrote a letter to the, Minister of Energy at the time was Seamus O'Regan, said this doesn't work for us. And to their credit, the federal Liberal government said, all right, we're going to make an exception. We're not going to tax standing heating oil. We're not going to touch natural gas, propane. We'll only make sure that the second carbon tax applies to in fact, applies to gasoline and diesel. And of course, another carve-out, which has created some real political interest over the past couple of months as well.
So just for our viewers at home, when we say PBO, I want to help them out and let them understand that this is called the Parliamentary Budget Officer in Ottawa. And is that like an Auditor General type of person, or is it's more of an, tell us about that,
They have an Auditor General as well.
Right, they do have an Auditor General federally.
It's an arm's length body that's supposed to evaluate policy and provide credible costing.
Okay.
So they do a lot of different types of policies, like the basic income proposals.
Okay.
But it's an important office for people who want to hold the government to account.
Right. Well, and it
The
gives
criticism of them is they lack the technical expertise to evaluate some of these more complex policies. As Dan was pointing out, you can evaluate a single policy at a time and it may miss the interaction of all the other things you're doing. So 2 wrongs can make a right. And so they're not ignoring that possibility, or the compounding effects aren't picked up in the estimates that they're producing.
A question for you, Dan, politically, and there's lots of discussion now, been for a while, about axing the tax. You've mentioned quite a few years this has been in the works, this carbon tax schemes of the first, the second, and all the additions. In 1993 was my first election that I volunteered on just after graduating from high school. And I decided to go with the blue team, but because it was the GST and how they took off the Canadian manufacturer's tax and replaced it with a 7%. And you were elected in 1993, and I believe, and saw like firsthand that political kind of ramifications after 8 years of Mulrooney and the sweep. Do you feel that, with all of this carbon tax and gas prices, maybe it's even worse right now politically for the current government because of the magnitude of the taxes compared to at that point? I mean, it's hard to compare necessarily, but we're in a political climate now. People have very little patience. Do you see this having political ramifications? And further to that,
Undoubtedly. Unquestionably.
and further to that, for politicians that promise to axe the tax, is it that simple that a new government could just throw this whole scheme out? How possible is that?
Two good
I
questions.
mean, GST was promised to be eliminated by two
Can I just raise
successive
one
prime
important
ministers.
difference with the GST?
Can they do without the revenue?
That's tricky.
In
So
between that time, I'm using a prop, a little hat that I got back in 2008, the green shift.
Okay.
That Stéphane Dion, my leader, I was the energy guy. I was the guy that helped people predict prices, and I remember him explaining this whole theory to me, and I just said, this doesn't make sense. I mean, I understand it, but you're not going to be able to sell it.
No, it's
and,
very difficult to message.
We got a shellacking in that election, not as bad as we did in 2011. The political ramifications here, I think, are well known. The Liberal Party, my party, and as I predicted on a number of stations here in Atlantic Canada, would suffer the beginning of the end on July 1st of 2023. That's because the two carbon taxes were applied in many of the Atlantic provinces, most notably Nova Scotia. That's not to say that dragging their feet was a wise idea politically, but when people were suddenly confronted with a 24 cent increase on July 1st, 2023, you could actually see the polling move. And my old campaign manager, a guy named Keto Maggie, runs Main Street polling. I'm very good friends with some of the old pollsters that Nick Nanos. He and I actually, taking glasses off, used to look alike. They would confuse us for brothers. But more seriously, there is no doubt that the implications at a time in which the economy is slipping for many people, in which there appears to be fewer jobs, where there is an immigration crisis, where there is a housing crisis, where there is, as your colleague in Nova Scotia will attest to at Dalhousie University, and has spoken to this many times, the Sylvain Chalavois, as food professor, there are a number of compounding issues. Whether they are directly related or indirectly related, the public has already made the connections, and they will demand that parties are going to have to make a decision to fish or cut bait. Now, here's more political fine point here. If the Greens, the Bloc, the NDP, and the Liberals are firm on maintaining the status quo, then you can see why the Conservatives have an even shot at picking up 50% of the votes or more in this country. It is going to be a landslide for them just on this one issue alone.
And will they be able to axe the tax after the election? Of course, government can do whatever they want, but this has been multiple years of layers of tax and tax. Is it going to be that simple?
I think Scott Moe's doing it in Saskatchewan. I think some premiers, even New Democratic Party premiers, the most latest, probably the most popular because he's the newest, Wab Kinew in Manitoba has taken off 14 cents off a liter of gasoline. He's not touching the carbon tax because he can't.
Yeah.
The federal government has won the right to the backstop, but my goodness, it's been unpopular. In Ontario, my province, the Liberal government, which had dominated for years, went down to crushing defeat. It's never been able to recover its party status because, yes, there was a green energy issue, but there was also the cap and trade tax, by the way, which is probably a more efficient way of approaching this, but that's just my own opinion. I'll let smarter people handle that. I think it's inevitable that this thing is going to die a quick death. How soon they can stop it may be as simple as they'll end the collection, lay off the 490 federal civil servants that have been hired. and perhaps provide a little bit more clarity as to what their intentions are, because you can't just say, well, we're going to walk away from this. You have to have some kind of, of alternative. I think the word that you're going to hear a lot of, and again, I was a consumer critic for the Liberal Party for many years, is more carrot, less stick. The system you have now is a stick. Some people say, yeah, well, I get some money at the end. You still have to pay it. I think they're going to try to find a way around this if they want to maintain this. The bigger issue, and it's not for this panel here today, is net zero, because that's the granddaddy of all this. That's the low-hanging fruit's the carbon tax. You can eliminate that, but you still have to deal with all the other stuff that you're obliged to. And you signed a treaty in 2015 called the Climate Accord. Perhaps in that, the government's going to say, we'll build more pipelines, we'll get energy east going again. Maybe at the end of the day, we'll emphasize Article 6 of that agreement, which basically says Canada can get an exemption, doesn't need to beat itself on carbon taxes by selling, oodles amount and catching up with the United States, Australia, Qatar, et cetera, on LNG. So maybe that's a way to approach. I don't know. I haven't been asked for my policy advice, but from a political point of view, this thing is dead in the water, and those who are very much behind it can kick and scream all they want. The game's over.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they missed the mark on the messaging right out of the gate, and just convincing Canadians on why the benefit of some kind of a tax plus a rebate. If you do better, you get more of a rebate. The governments always have issues with messaging, as you know. We've all seen them come and go, haven't we, Jody?
When you're explaining.
When you're explaining, you're losing.
No.
Herb wanted to add something to
Well,
a
the
previous
GST is an
comment.
interesting one to think about, because the Liberals in '93 had promised to scrap it in NAFTA. And they get elected in a landslide, and once they're elected, they kept it. So the government that brought it in wiped it out. And Brian Mulroney liked to say he was the one who balanced the budget, not Paul Martin. And there was an element of truth to it, that the economy was in a slump, but the policies were in place. Now, the difference between the GST and the carbon price is that the GST was part of a shift in tax policy to tax efficiency to promote investment and growth, encourage savings over consumption. And so it was what we would call a growth enhancing type of policy. The carbon price, we're trying to do as little damage as we can to the incentive to invest, the incentive to produce. And so what we're telling everyone isn't that this is going to cause growth like we did with the GST, and which was a reality under NAFTA, is instead where NAFTA we were aligning with our partners to make sure we had a corporate tax that was in line with what the US was going to have, so that those companies would come here. With the carbon price, we're completely out of step at this point. We anticipated Obama was going to lead the US in a direction of price. Trump didn't go there, and now Biden's going the other way. He's subsidizing industry. So as Dan says with carrots, even if we wanted to do more, then we have to take account of the fact we're no longer aligned with our largest trading partner. We're creating a headwind where they're creating a subsidy, and we're starting to see the companies going south. Like, the main reason we have companies in Canada isn't to produce for the Canadian market, it's to export into the US. And if we don't think about competitiveness, which this federal government hasn't done since they've come in, energy sector's been on the ropes. Most of the industrial base in Ontario has been on the ropes. They're trying to create new industries. But a lot of this is coming from the politics you haven't talked about, which is surprising for the Maritimes, which is fiscal federalism in the federal system. There's winners and losers under the climate agenda. So the hydro-rich provinces stand to gain a lot. So Quebec, Manitoba, BC have energy resources that a New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, even Ontario doesn't have. So that left us with nuclear, and we're chasing after that one. But again, without government and getting in on side, and we've never heard the federal government come out until relatively recent, even suggest that nuclear was clean. You start to create, you couldn't even get the subsidies to develop that for most of the time period when those companies needed it. So again, the carbon tax is probably in trouble, not because of carbon pricing being a bad idea per se, but the execution of the policy, not just the communication, but the fact that it was regionally insensitive, the fact that it really didn't take account of competitiveness of exporters, the carbon leakage. There's a bunch of problems that came in with it. And then the zeal, I think when they went to Minister Gibault, who started talking just transition, it started to feel like regionally this is a very different agenda. It's not net zero anymore. This is about restraining Alberta and Saskatchewan in Confederation. And as the Atlantic provinces were starting to show weakness in fortress Fortress Red, we got the Carr vote. And so,
Yeah, on home heating. fuel.
again, the
Home heating oil.
Maritimes are always being bought cheap by the feds. And I think that if we had stronger leaders like of old, you would see a very different dynamic about what resources get developed. Like the Atlantic Loop was also part of the plan for a while. And when we found out we were paying for that in power, rates support dissipated pretty quick. So we're really asking Canadians today, are you willing to pay for climate change or climate action? And then if the answer is no, we're going to be having an election on, do you think we've gone far enough, or do you think we should just stop it? And we're not having that debate right now. Everyone's pretending we're still trying to save the planet. But I don't think that's what this carbon price debate is about anymore.
Not anymore. No. It's cost of living.
I don't know if it ever really was. It's like, yeah.
Yeah.
If you said the $300 is the mark, it's just, yeah, I can see people being very frustrated about the whole thing.
Yep. No, for sure. I mean, when we took power in 2018, our argument to Ottawa then was we're a predominantly export province, but our exporters are working at a disadvantage with the Americans south of the border, and there's just no way we can compete. So give us a special deal here. We were able to negotiate our own carbon pricing, which really involved a rebate at the pumps. We put about $50 million into climate change programming, and gave income tax reduction, incentives to the public, and other provinces beside us had the same deal at one point, and then theirs was taken away. And like PEI Newfoundland, there was never any pattern, no rhyme, no reason why this one was accepted or not. Ontario would take our exact plan to Ottawa and be denied. So it was just the weirdest thing ever on how this ever worked out. We've got one coal plant in Baldoon. Nova Scotia's got 5 or 6. And it's just, I don't know. At the time, McNeil was in power in Nova Scotia, so maybe he got a special deal that way. I don't know. Maybe Brian Glent would have got us a special deal. But all he would talk about was revenue neutral. And nobody really understood what does that mean, really. And most people didn't buy it, especially in rural New Brunswick, that revenue neutral existed. Because nobody trusts government with any tax money.
All I know is we're paying $1.80 a liter now.
I know.
And it's a heck of a lot.
It's more than that now, probably, because the interrupter clause kicked in yesterday.
How many hours have gone by? It's going up by the hour.
It is. And tomorrow is Friday. It's supposed to go back down.
Down a few cents.
So I want to. Can we get off the carbon just a little bit and talk about gas
We
prices?
can park it a little bit, yeah.
Can we talk about gas prices? So
Well,
Dan,
that's what I want.
you're the gas
I did
guru.
a little
segue.
into 180.
Segue, Joe.
And I don't know if you're paying attention down here, Dan, but I think you're paying attention to most regions. But we changed our legislation here in New Brunswick so that we can have a lot of the same levers with regulated gas prices as Nova Scotia. But yesterday, the interrupter clause kicks in New Brunswick. Our gas goes up, I don't know what it was, 8 or 9 cents.
Yeah,
Nova Scotia PEI don't touch theirs. Tomorrow is a Friday, our adjustment day, and now we're saying we're going back down. So, what was the
about
point of the
15
interrupter
cents in the
clause?
last week.
Do you understand it enough to tell us here in New Brunswick, or blows my mind?
You are quite the genius. Look, I predict gas prices. I did so with Gas Buddy, but also mostly for all of Canada. I've been doing it for 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
The hardest part of all of this is trying to figure out what's in the minds of bureaucrats, and each and every one of them has their own agenda, their own specific formula, and they rely on very different data. PEI looks at rack pricing, which is the wholesale price that the largest suppliers into the market provide. So Irving, Esso, Shell, et cetera, Petro, Suncor. Nova Scotia uses a 5-day average based on Platts scan. New Brunswick uses something similar to that, but they also have only regulation on the wholesale side, not on the retail side. There was confusion this weekend as to how the carbon tax would be applied. One province, PEI, didn't move. New Brunswick apparently didn't move, but Nova Scotia and Newfoundland did. So there's a lot of arbitrariness in how this goes about. Yes, they have their formula, but it's not based on the free market that moves prices every second day. So predictability becomes a little bit more of a challenge. And some people get upset when I do predictions, but I say, well, these are predictions that exist based on the New York Harbor price, spot price for gasoline. They're accurate in Quebec, Ontario, all the other provinces, most of the U.S. Northeast and the U.S. Midwest and U.S. West, Pacific Coast. So I can afford to be wrong, given that there's a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, arbitrariness. The issue is not going to be so much whether it goes up or down. It's that we're on a trajectory to much higher energy prices. And there's a number of reasons for that, related in many respects to divestment policies, ESG, environmental, social, and governance mandates over the past 10 years. There has not been a lot of investment in oil and infrastructure. You're in the Maritimes. You know full well you've lost, 2 refineries. One I helped save back in 1999. To come by chance at Holyrood, gone, history. Now it's turned into a biodiesel facility. And of course, further than that, going down the road, Eastern Passage, the Esso plant, Imperial plant in Dartmouth that shut down. So you effectively, short of Irving, become basically price takers into a market in which whatever vagaries take place globally, you're going to wind up paying for at some point in the not too distant future. Bottom line, we're going to be seeing an average of a 20-cent a liter increase this summer. I don't see it coming down quickly, mostly because OPEC has finally had enough of the gamesmanship and what they call a dysfunctional market, living in la-la land, in which you're using examples that have nothing to do with fundamental supply and demand, but everything to do with, headline news, China having a bad couple of months economically, or maybe, things like the US Fed not moving quickly enough on interest rates. However we plan or play this out, oil has now moved up about $6-7 a barrel in the past month. It's likely to go up another 8 or 9 by the time it's all said and done. And we switch from winter to summer gasoline. Probably, if we haven't already, in the case of New Brunswick, which might have got a bit of a jump start, we're going to be seeing that next couple of weeks. That's another 10 cents a liter in and of itself.
Plus HST, right? We'll have to add the tax onto that too.
HST
So
at 15%. I think it's terrible here at 13%, but I keep reminding myself 15% really is impactful.
Last time the federal government dropped the HST here, the provincial premier decided to backstop it and take it and add it back onto the provincial taxpayer. So
I thought all the oil companies did that.
no.
So
No.
you're predicting a 20% or a 20-cent increase this summer.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing across the country a number of premiers talking about a 23% increase in carbon tax. Do you feel that that component is a distraction of what's really going on with our gas prices?
I think they see shades of 2022 all over again. When we saw prices moving up to records like 241.9 in Vancouver back in September of 2022, or 215 a liter here in Toronto in June of 2022. We're already heading towards Vancouver's prices overnight are going to 215 a liter, and we haven't really hit that point where demand is going to pick up for summer driving. Remember, the United States is having this big problem in terms of its Fed. They want to reduce interest rates, but my God, the economic news on the labor front is really good. And people are buying. People are, not everybody is obviously sharing in the wealth, but perhaps due to a vast amount of money that the Biden administration has pumped into the economy via the IRA, and I'm not talking about the old Irish Republican IRA, but the Inflation Reduction Act. In critical, people understand that we're really small players when it comes to these things. We're huge when it comes to export of our energy products, but we're small potatoes when it comes to affecting or denting commodity prices. That's done in the United States and other circumstances around the world. And I want to really underline, China's demand is up, United States' demand is up, even Europe demand for fossil fuels, for hydrocarbons is up. It's inevitable that we're going to see these prices rise.
It's not going away anytime soon.
No.
And
And you can bring as many EVs on the road as you want. It still takes a lot of fossil fuels to build an EV.
Darn right.
So the demand for fossil fuels are going up. How does that affect our ambition to address climate change? I don't know if this is all going to help climate change.
It's a
at all.
tough circular
It is.
economy. Very
It just,
difficult. Especially when you talk about mining, which is none of our expertise here at the table and on TV here, I don't think, but you have to mine so many of those precious materials also to build the batteries and the EVs that, back in the day.
Yeah,
when
mining isn't exactly clean.
No, and back in
uh,
the day when the pipelines were scrapped because of the upstream and downstream emissions, what is the emission impact on mining, right? You get all those
Huge,
heavy
massive,
chemicals.
and
It is.
assuming you can get a permit. Look, the world's going to need 5 times the amount of copper production to meet electrification targets for 2050. That's part of the net zero agenda. I don't know how we're going to do it, not without really doing some nasty stuff. Speaking of which, I think where Canadians get frustrated on the carbon issue is that we take the hit. We're being the International Boy Scouts and International Girl Guides, but we buy products from China. I don't see any carbon issue or any kind of penalty or signal being imposed on them when we bring in a significant amount of product in here. So you're really putting Canadian business and consumers at a disadvantage. I'm not picking on China. I'm just simply saying.
Well, look at the oil we bring in from other countries.
Sell them a lot more energy, sell them a lot more natural gas. I mean, they're only across the Pacific. It's on the other side of the pond.
Herb, I saw you squiggle there a little
Yeah,
bit around that.
but this goes back to when the climate agenda came in after 2015 and the Paris Agreement. The decision was made to tax on production but not on imports. So we don't tax the carbon content. So if you look at a country like Denmark, they got really green in a hurry because they just switched from producing to importing. Now you can ask yourself if that's a good idea in the long run. The answer is probably no for a place like New Brunswick. But the bias that's built in is that Ontario can do well without Alberta's oil because if they want to reduce emissions and the world price was low, they'll just import and refine that. Whereas if they take Alberta oil and the emissions are embedded in it, that's going to be priced. This was an argument that we could not get across to the federal government at all when we went to these discussions, that you could have a different basis that you tax the carbon content imports or produced. But we have a bias built in on how we do the carbon accounting, and it's biased against producers in Canada. So you wouldn't mine here because you'll get the emissions, but you'll import the mined product into Canada to refine into
And
something
do we
else.
not tax imports because of international free trade agreements type of thing, or was that?
No,
did that have
it was an
anything to do with
agreement
it?
under the climate accounting
Oh.
that it would be based on what you produce, not what you import.
Okay.
Now,
It's like coal and
yeah.
Baldoon versus
I'd,
bringing it in from Venezuela.
we're
Right.
Bringing coal in from Venezuela
More emulsion?
oh, emulsion.
for rather
Yeah.
than mining
Let's
it
bring
in
that up
Brunswick.
again. We gotta bring that up again. Jeez. Talk about former politicians, Dan.
Yeah.
So,
Uh-oh.
yeah.
We're a breed, aren't we?
Yeah. Now, Herb, you're in the political science area of work as well. What I wanted to know provincially here in New Brunswick, with all of this that's going, there's a little bit of a football. Is it the federal government's fault? Is it the provincial government? But there's an election in the coming months in New Brunswick. Do you think that there will be, regardless, some political fallout at the provincial level under Blaine Higgs as part of the government, whether it's the federal, provincial, who's what? How do you think that's going to be?
Well, I think we've seen a clear message across the country. Everyone's fighting Ottawa.
Yeah.
And so the main thing you see, like a Danielle Smith, a Scott Moe, a Doug Ford, is not to work with the federal government anymore, but to fight them as the bad guys that are hurting us. And so I don't know if that's actually really constructive to have, but it's sort of just one of the failings I think politically we have in Canada right now is we've had a complete breakdown of the ability of premiers and prime ministers to work together. We've got adversarial cabinet ministers at the meetings. Initially, when the Trudeau government came in, they reinitiated the First Ministers meeting, which under Harper, as I understood it, hadn't happened in a while. And so there was a lot of hope that this was going to lead to things like lower trade barriers between provinces, more coordination and cooperation. But I think we're at a low point now. So the best political strategy you can have as a sitting premier is say, I'm going to fight Ottawa. Or I'm going to get our
Danny
fair
Williams
share.
effect.
The
Yeah.
test of time. The test of time.
But you don't even hear the opposition parties in those provinces saying, we're going to work with Ottawa. They just sort of stay silent on it.
Well, they're trying to get away from them as well. Get
But
the
if-
stink off.
But if you change the prime minister to someone who has, let's say, a little more cordial relationships with the provinces, we could see a switch again. The provinces are about to be desperate for cash as the economy slows. So they're going to expect Ottawa to transfer more. And so that's where I think the politics are going to change, is that right now there's a lot of swagger among the premiers because they sense vulnerability, but their coffers are also really full because Ottawa's been transferring gobs and gobs of money to the provinces, but that erodes quickly.
A question for both of you, which would be interesting if you have a perspective on the life of the longevity, or how long will Justin Trudeau, will he stay as prime minister and as leader to carry out to the next election, or do we think there could be enough pressure to have him step aside? What are your thoughts?
Dan?
Well, look, I think the Prime Minister has a very solid caucus that, with very limited exceptions, is not about to bite the hand that got them elected. In a word, he doesn't have much in the way of pressure from the caucus, but it might be noticeable for some people who are not familiar with this. In the past, caucus meetings, when we were in government, took place with the Prime Minister, senators, ministers, caucus members, and maybe 2 or 3 staff from the whip's office to bring notes in and out, because if you're in there for 2 or 3 hours, things do happen. Never did you have a circumstance where the Prime Minister's office staff and Prime Minister's own principal secretary and executive sat there and took notes on members of Parliament and basically said, you want to ask a question to the PM, you have to vet it through us. This is supposed to be behind doors. What that means is that the Prime Minister has extraordinary control over an effete caucus. That wasn't the case in my time, nor was it the case of previous caucuses to my time, 93 to 2011. You usually had very strong leaders who would duke it out with members, and if they respected them enough, they would change policies. A lot of policy got changed, in that time. I think Justin Trudeau doesn't have to worry about his caucus, and he is probably not hearing well enough. Ears not close enough to the ground to recognize that, for all intents and purposes, he's done. He's finished. And the longer that he has stayed here, beyond 7, 8, 9, 10 years, whatever the the expiry date is for members of Parliament and prime ministers in particular, he may have done untold damage, which is what I referred to earlier. I think the damage that has been done to the Liberal Party, the Liberal brand, is going to be there for a very, very long time, no matter who comes now. Because even if you had a white knight in shining armor coming in, whoever that should be, and he hasn't done a very good job at seeing a successor, an obvious successor, take over. It's likely that the Liberal Party is going to be spending a lot of time in the penalty box, at least for 2 or 3 elections, and they may very well miss out on the opportunity of a resurging economy, which would normally help them.
For sure. Herb, anything to add?
No, I think Dan's the insider on that one, so I'm going to defer to him.
Yeah, good one. Good one. Yeah, it's very interesting the way your comment about how that caucus performs. It is interesting because we don't see that here, and we've not seen it here in the past. Like, you don't get your questions vetted. No. You duke it out. Yeah. You talk it out, or at least you try anyways, and go that route. But I think more and more we see more staff in the room.
Yes.
Without trying to talk to the class here a little bit too much.
No, for sure. You see that controlled by the staffers around, whether that means the leader has the control or whether they don't have not much of a knowledge and control, and they have their staffers that are around bullying their control, and it seems to be a common thing. As soon as you let staffers start coming into caucus, and that happened in New Brunswick, I know, for quite a number of years now. But
oh, they were definitely in the room.
Yeah.
Taking notes at least.
Yeah.
And they don't join the conversation though so much unless they're asked. So
no,
there's that. But it's very interesting the way you talk about vetting questions for
the role of an MP has changed.
Yeah, and note taking.
The role of the MP has changed. Even your staff is chosen by Katie Telford and the gang.
Yeah.
In my time, you had that. Members of Parliament could provide and make private members' bill real. They could speak on issues as long as they were within the parameters of, you're not going to vote against the government on a matter of confidence. They may not have liked you. They may have said you can't be on your favorite committees, and you're not going to go on those special trips that you need to go on to learn more about what's happening wherever. But members of Parliament, the role of members of Parliament, in my view, have taken a retrograde step backwards.
Yeah.
I passed 2 private members' bills, and they weren't small. I amended the Criminal Code, number of changes to the Competition Act, organ donor registry, the first aid. I'm not saying in my case it's an example. There may have been other examples where that didn't happen, but the ability to grab an issue and run with it, especially in a majority setting, was truly remarkable. As well, the committees. The committees were always in charge of their own destiny, and often, were able to say to the leadership of the party, get out of the room. get rid of the staffers, get rid of, except for the clerk and the people, taking researchers, all members of parliament had to get rid of their whips. And you guys would understand this. These are the folks that are in there looking, making sure that you stay on course.
Yeah.
We'd often tell them to get out of the room. And I remember one particular case where the Conservatives, NDP, Liberal got together and made some big changes in 2008 when it was desperately needed, when we were going into the tank with the global recession. And we came up with the idea on VAT accelerating tax credits on depreciation for a lot of business. And that made a huge difference, a substantial difference, because it meant a lot of people could make huge investments at a time when everyone was reluctant to do so. There's a number of other things that happened, and I don't want to go on at great length, but the role of the member of parliament, in my view, in my eyes, has unfortunately diminished dramatically. And it happened after I was there, obviously, but it may have been part of the Harper government, but certainly was accelerated under the Trudeau government.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
It's very, very good perspective there. Dan.
Yeah, and the point about having the staff in the room is not even as much as them participating in terms of speaking, but the note-taking, Dan, you mentioned. They're taking notes and checking and watching and seeing who says what. It's being used against them. There's all this stuff that goes on, and so
no comment.
yeah. So it's you're right, but it's our democracy.
So where's the breaking point for the public
yeah.
on the economy? Like, how much more can we take?
Well, you're already seeing they can't take it. So the shoe that we're waiting to drop is really on house prices and real estate, because it's sort of a miracle that some of the places like in Ontario with the $1 million homes are still carrying them. But the counterfactual that's interesting to think about is if COVID hadn't hit, if we hadn't had supply chain disruptions, if Putin hadn't gone into Ukraine to cause disruption in oil markets, and suppose we'd maintained price stability, would the climate agenda have been rocked the way it has been? Would the federal government have been as unpopular as they are now? Because they were all what it became called team transitory, that this was going to pass so we don't have to worry about it. And what ended up happening instead is that it came out they were pouring fuel on the fire, so the high rates of newcomers to Canada suddenly got attention because they were going to certain centers that were causing a lot of impact. Again, most of this is coming right now through the housing market, frustrations with home ownership aspirations, capacity to rent, no sense of anything getting built to alleviate through the supply channel. And so it's raising a lot of attention towards there's no investment in Canada going on unless the federal government's subsidizing it.
Right.
There's no industries really looking to come in here and do anything. It's especially the traditional sectors like mining. You just can't get a mine up and running in Canada.
No, that's what Dan iterated earlier. Good luck getting a permit.
So with all of this, I think consumers have already got fed up. Again, Canadian consumers haven't been spending income, they've been borrowing. And the record level of indebtedness of private households in Canada is the real vulnerability that we have. So rising interest rates, they've got a big stock of debt. So in the 80s, it took 21% interest rate to cause the recession. What we're looking now is the Bank of Canada kind of feathering it, trying to see if we can do another quarter point, push a little higher, or does that take us over the tipping point?
So what's going to happen in New Brunswick when the cycle starts catching up of higher interest rates and renewals when people are already stretched? Is the federal government going to have to come along and bail out mortgages or let them go?
Let them go. That's what happened in the 80s.
Yeah.
They're already pre-insured through CMHC, so the disaster is on the individual householder, not the government per se.
And I think we're going to see a number of them, I'm afraid. I hate to be Debbie Downer, but
Well, no, I think
coming.
the biggest weakness in the province right now, because we're so reliant on the federal transfers instead of our own sources of income and our own production base, is that if they even freeze transfers at the level they're at now in an inflationary environment, that's a real cut.
Yeah.
And so you're going to look at it the same dynamic as Frank McKenna came into, which is there seemed to be a lot of federal money that suddenly dried up, and it led to a very different type of decision making. And as I understand it, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the Hatfield government that transitioned to McKenna. He got all the seats. And so we've seen the public react this way to cost of living crises before and frustration with just the economic climate. And that's the concern I think we should be looking forward at, that the complacency that you see a lot of premiers having right now about the economy, everything seems fine, right? We're talking mostly about how we're not fixing healthcare.
Right.
But every province has the same problems. Every province has the same complacency. The business community across Canada keeps talking about the lack of investment, the lack of incentive to do anything here. And that's where I think we're going to see the shoe drop.
Okay.
And Poilievre isn't the guy for the economy.
Okay.
Who?
Polyev.
Oh,
Poilievre, the common sense guy.
Ex-tax,
Populist
spike the
leaders
hike.
are associated with loss of GDP of about 15% over 15 years. So
Well, we'll have to have you on.
Oh, we got to have you on again.
And you as
That's
well,
the
Dan,
shoe.
when we hit the 20-cent mark this summer.
That's the shoe that dropped.
But this has been a great
Being
discussion.
right. The voice of doom.
I know.
Yeah,
we
Great
do.
discussion. In some ways, the carbon tax is a distraction to other issues, and you guys really helped us a lot and our viewers of unpacking this issue, but also exploring some of the other issues facing New Brunswickers and Canadians. Some very, very big issues.
Yep, and we had just kind of recap on our
Oh,
guests.
yes. Well, yeah, Herb Emery,
Herb Emery from-
economist and the chair of the political science department at UMB. Thank you very much for taking your time out. We really appreciate it. And Dan McTeague, former MP for a number of years and also now the current president of the Canadians for Affordable Energy. Excellent insight as well. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you both.
Grateful to be here and good to be here with you as well, Herb. I look forward to doing this again, maybe on better terms when it drops 40 cents a liter.
Yeah, we'll celebrate that time.
So let's hope.
We'll see you
Good deal.
all a week from tonight,
Yep.
7 p.m.
Thanks for joining us on our new time, 7
Yes.
p.m. Atlantic,
Thursdays.
Thursdays.
Have a good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.